So welcome to each and every one of you as we experience our circle of wisdom and support with the UCM, Universal Church of the Master Speakers Series, which we have the second Tuesday of every month. And we are so privileged to have Tim Mauro discussing the mysticism of the Bible. And Tim says, this collection of ancient sacred writings, which we commonly call or refer to as the Bible or the Holy Bible, can be a valuable teaching resource for gaining a higher understanding of God and building a consciousness of peace, happiness, love, and prosperity in our lives. But most of us tend to forget that there are Middle Eastern teachings written by and for Middle Eastern people. For most of us in the modern Western world, much of the message is lost in translation. In biblical times, for Semitic cultures, mysticism was and still is an important part of obtaining this higher consciousness. The word mysticism can be defined as knowledge gained through subjective, intuitive experience, beyond ordinary circumstance, persons, places, and things. And so Tim is an incredible scholar of spiritual writings, including the Bible. He has the ability to synthesize spiritual teachings in a concrete way that we can receive them and gain the wisdom from him. He is also an incredible musician, songwriter, and vocalist. And so it's with great honor that I offer you our wonderful Tim Mauro. And before we invite him on, we're going to have our wonderful Reverend Lynn Rogers lead us in opening prayer. Welcome to everyone.
Yes, welcome.
And I'm just going to light this candle. I'm sorry, Lynn.
Oh, fine.
And this candle is just a symbol, my friends, of the loving light and energy of hope and healing that we can bring to each other. And it's become our speakers series tradition. So we're lighting this candle for all of you. And Tim will receive this candle at the end of this presentation. And so we light the candle as that symbol of the light that we are for and with each other. And so just take a deep breath, and we will now send it right over to our wonderful Lynn.
Well, let us all take another deep breath, remembering that we are light, we are truth, we are spirit, we are divinity in expression. And remember that the mystical spirit of compassion, of truth, has blossomed in cultures around our globe. And tonight, appropriately, on this night of exploring mysticism from the Bible, which was set in the Middle East, may we continue tonight to be channels of light and protection for the innocent, all the innocent in that area tonight. So as we remember that the mystical experience is happening now, and that this is the esoteric heart of faith, and that esoteric heart of faith can link us to those of all faiths who come in the now from the heart with the spirit of life. We are linked. And so we take a moment and open up to our own mystical inner being. May we hear to gain what we need to from this talk tonight, as it furthers our ability to be channels of light in the world. Blessed be.
Blessed be.
And so it is. Thank you very much, Lynn.
That was beautiful.
And thank you, Janet, for that introduction. Let's see if I can live up to that. So what I'd like to do is start off with about 45 minutes of input. And that's a euphemism for talk or lecture. That's something I learned from Dr. Bruce Rotchen. If you use words like lecture, people tend to lose interest pretty quickly. But if I use the word input, you're more likely to stick around and listen. And then we'll take a 5-minute break, no more than 5, and then I'll open up the floor for questions or comments. So is that in keeping with your policies, Janet?
That sounds beautiful. It's however you want to do it, Tim.
Okay,
this is your night.
Thank you. So if a question or comment comes to mind while I'm presenting this bunch of input, please write it down and we can discuss any question you'd like, but I would prefer we keep the discussion in the realm of the scriptures. Doesn't need to necessarily have to be specifically what I'm talking about tonight, but let's keep it in the realm of the Bible. So if there's something about the Bible that you remember hearing from Sunday school as a child and it's been bothering you ever since, we can look into it. I can't guarantee I'll be able to answer every question. I'm not Rocco Errico or Bruce Rotchen, but I'll see what I can do for you.
Now, would it be all right, Tim? I'm sorry to interrupt. If people are afraid they're going to lose their questions, can they put them in the chat?
Sure.
And then we'll take a look at them after you are through.
Sure, of course. Sounds great. That's the beauty of Zoom. Now, the subject we'll be exploring is the mysticism of the Bible. This is something that caught my interest many years ago. Can you hear Joan? Okay. This is something that caught my interest many years ago when I was an awkward and painfully shy young adult, having recently grown from an awkward and painfully shy adolescent. And being such, I attracted several well-meaning friends who decided that what I needed was to find Jesus and be saved and adopt the Christian lifestyle. Much to their dismay, though, I was not interested in their religion at all. I was the potential convert that got away. What they didn't realize was that I had already found a spiritual path that made a lot more sense to me and was helping me immensely in changing my life for the better. And that was the New Thought teachings. I was a member at the time of the Firelight Church of Religious Science in Milpitas. But what really intrigued me was how the minister at my church was teaching something very different than the beliefs of my born-again Christian friends, and yet was often referring to the same book, that same Bible, sometimes even the same passages. And I wasn't raised in a religious home, so I knew nothing about this Bible, and I mean nothing. I knew a little bit about Jesus from the movies, Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell, and about the birth story from the traditional Christmas carols, but that was about it. So I asked the minister of my church, Reverend Sandra Threadgill, about how I could learn more about it in an objective way. He suggested a good place to start would be by reading this book, which I still have, Let There Be Light by Dr. Rocco Errico, who was one of her teachers and would eventually become one of mine. So I started reading it and couldn't put it down. That's saying a lot for me concerning reading. And from that time, the scriptures became something that I've always enjoyed getting to know better, even to this day. And one of the first things I learned was that the Bible is made up of Eastern teachings written by and for Middle Eastern people. Had it been written for us, it would be in a very different style and context and different terminology. So it can serve us as a teaching reference, for our spiritual growth and better understanding of who and what we are and of this thing we call God. But we need to understand that it comes to us from a culture that even today we tend to misunderstand, and also 2,000 to 4,000 years of antiquity. But when we take the time to look into the language it was originally written in, Hebrew and Aramaic, and the symbolism, the customs, and what I've always found most intriguing, the mysticism, that's when we get so much more out of it. Now, Dr. Rocco Errico once pointed out that what most Bible readers do in Western society is to read their own spiritual and political agenda into it. And you can find passages to take out of context to prove any agenda you might have. That's certainly been the case with the numerous Orthodox Christian organizations over the past 1,500 years, but don't fool yourself. That's also been the case with the New Thought teachings that I've been a student of most of my adult life. And yes, I've even heard several UCM ministers do it as well. I'm not saying that it's wrong. If it helps you back up a lesson that you're trying to get across, that's great. But I've always found that I can get so much more out of it when I challenge myself to read out from it rather than into it. By that I mean to try to understand the original context that it was written in and the mindset of the readers it was intended for. See, now, when I use the term mysticism of the Bible, I'm not talking about something strange or otherworldly. When we use that word in a biblical sense, it simply means learning through intuition. By quieting your mind and letting what we sometimes call that still small voice help you through a difficult time, or make the right decision, or expand your consciousness, expand your understanding. So whenever we read about God having a conversation with a character in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, it's either because the story is an allegory or the character is gaining a greater understanding through a dream or a vision. So we'll look into several examples of that in just a few minutes. But first, a brief background on the book itself. The word Bible comes from the Latin word biblia, which is derived from the Greek word biblos, which translates to library or collection of scrolls. And that's exactly what it is, a collection of ancient writings that were canonized first by the Jewish authorities, then centuries later, the Christian authorities. Most of you already know that it's divided into two sections, a collection of 39 books, which we call the Old Testament, which is the primary sacred text of the Jewish religion, and then another 27 books, which we call the New Testament, which is the primary sacred text of the Christian tradition. But they also consider the Old Testament important in their religion. The Old Testament covers a historical period, or I should say pseudo-historical period, of about 2,000 years, and was written over a period of about 1,000, whereas the New Testament covers about a 90-year period and was written over a period of about 50 years. The Old Testament is about the spiritual evolution of a nation. The New Testament is about the spiritual evolution of a great teacher who came out of that nation and whose teachings became the foundation of a whole new movement and eventually a monstrosity of a world religion. Now, I've heard a lot of people, particularly in teachings like religious science or Universal Church of the Master, say about the Bible, "Give me the teachings of Jesus and scrap the rest." Not at all interested in those stories of that vengeful God of blood and thunder in the Old Testament. And that's understandable. But what most people don't realize is that the whole thrust of Jesus's ministry was a spiritual interpretation of the Torah, or we could say the law, which is the first 5 books in the Old Testament, supposedly written by Moses, and of the prophets, who we read about later in the Old Testament. So to really get the most out of Jesus and his teachings, it's important to get an understanding of the Old Testament, of the Torah, and the prophets. So my challenge to you this week is to get out your Bible, probably sitting in a dusty corner in your bookshelf, and read some of the things that we'll explore in the next few minutes, and approach them from an allegorical and mystical understanding, and realize that it's a story about each of us and the spiritual growth that we're all undergoing, each in our own way. Now, a good place to begin is usually at the beginning. And when we start to read that first book in the Bible called Genesis, first thing we get are 2 different accounts of how the world began and how the human race began. How many of you knew there were 2 different stories of creation, and they contradict each other in many respects? The first story takes up all of chapter 1 and finishes about 3 passages into chapter 2. And it's the story about how God supposedly created the universe in 7 days. And it was meant to be read as prose poetry. It's all Eastern imagery and pageantry designed to teach us about a creative process that's forever unfolding and forever unfolding within each of us. These were not meant to be thought of as actual days. You know, the atheists and evolutionists have a field day with this, where they point out right away that in this story, God doesn't create the sun until the 5th day. So how could there be 4 days before that? And then the Christian apologists have their talking points to address that. But none of it matters, because none of that was meant to be taken literally. Starts with the statement, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, in the Aramaic or Hebrew language. Pretty much the same, just different pronunciations. My pronunciation of this will probably be terrible, but Rashim Alaha, in the beginning, God, which means there was no beginning. When they make the statement in the beginning and attach God, it means there was no beginning. So the writer was not trying to tell us that the universe was created 6,000 years ago or 1 billion years ago. It's an idea in the mind of God that always was. You know, this thing we call time that we use to measure how our world is constantly changing. So the question is, when did that begin? And what happened before then? While we're on the subject, when will time end? And what's going to happen after that? Now, first time someone put that question to me, it short-circuited my brain. So it's not about a 7-day project that some divine being happened to undertake at some point thousands of years ago. It's about a creative process that's taking place throughout eternity, and how each of us is taking part in it. See? So what happened on that first day in the story? God created the light of the day and the darkness of the night. This is a symbol of the first step in any new creation, moving from ignorance or innocence to understanding. We get a more direct lesson on that principle in, I believe, chapter 4 of the book of Proverbs, where we're advised, with all thy getting, get first understanding. See, that's why in the Jewish tradition, a new day starts at sundown. So for those of you on the West Coast, I should be saying good morning. because a new day, a new experience begins by moving from innocence to understanding. And then on the second day, what happened? A firmament between the water and the sky. Water here represents the creative medium of being. That is what we call in New Thought universal subjective mind, from which we get all of the universal laws, which we're so accustomed, like gravity or electricity, which we're all using right now, or the mixing of colors. If I were to take a dab of red paint and mix it with a dab of blue paint, what color would I get every time? Purple, of course. How about if every person in the whole world who's old enough were given a dab of red and blue paint, and everyone mixed them together at exactly the same moment? The principle of blue mixed with red making purple wouldn't run out. It wouldn't say, sorry, I'm all used up. Some of you are going to get yellow when you mix the red and blue. See, it's eternal and everywhere present. These principles work the same way for each of us, regardless of our religion, our race, or our beliefs. And the same is true on a metaphysical level. Like I was talking about at CCL a few months ago. Whatever definition you give yourself or your world, whatever beliefs you choose to embrace, that's the experience you're giving the world permission to unfold for you. Just as water is always ready, which I happen to have here, to take whatever form it's poured into. So this subjective mind is always ready to take whatever form in the physical plane that we give it permission to. If I were to pour this into a cube-shaped container, it would gladly take that form. So it's really important to be conscious of what form, what receptacle you're giving your thoughts to. Actually, as long as I have this, a little bit, in fact, a lot like what my teacher, Dr. J. Scott Neal, loved to say. It's really important to always think about what you're thinking about, because that's the experience you're giving your permission. That's the experience you're giving your world permission to unfold. You would also point out that everyone is thinking all day long, but few of us are thinking about what we're thinking about. My buddies and fellow students from Fremont Church, Lacey and Mary Jo, are saying, yeah, I remember that. Then on the third day, what happens? Well, God separated the waters from the dry land and also created vegetation. So in continuing to look at this metaphorically, we begin to see how the physical plane, that is, our experience out here, is ready to begin once the waters are gathered together. Hence, dry land is created on the third day. This is a process in the Middle East which is called the three kinome. It's a word in plural, kinome. The singular form is kinoma. And in the Aramaic language, it literally means a person. But when referring to God, it means an attribute. So the attributes of God in this creative process are mind, wisdom, and life or consciousness. So this was taught by the early Christian church fathers who spoke Aramaic. And when it was later given to the Greek and Latin-speaking followers, it was interpreted as three people in one and eventually made into a doctrine, hence the Trinity, Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But, I might get in some trouble for saying this, but God didn't even know about the Trinity until the year 335 So let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, does everyone see that? Someone tell me yes, because
No, we don't see it. We see you, but we don't see it. Did you hit share screen? There you go.
okay.
You got it.
So now when we look at the next 3 days, you notice a parallel to the first three. God is taking the background created on the previous 3 days and putting some animation to it. The fourth day, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament, signs of the seasons, days, and the years." In other words, he was decorating and arranging the light and darkness from that first day as stars and a sun and a moon. Then on the fifth day, he gave us fish and birds to populate the water and sky, created back on the second day, and on the sixth day, populated the land from the third day with land-dwelling animals, including, and the most important one, the human race. And God said, "Let us make man in our image and our likeness." And then male and female created he them. Several things about that statement that need to be clarified. First of all, who was God talking to? Who is this us in our image? Some people believe that he was talking to angels, and I've heard the religions that have the Trinity as part of their system say that God is a threefold being, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they tend to believe that that's where this us comes from. I also remember hearing Sylvia Brown speak at the Gnostic Church in Sunnyvale many years ago, and she was talking about how, well, in the Gnostic tradition, God is part male and part female, and so that's where this "let us" and "our image" comes from. But it's not likely that the author had any of those things in mind when writing the story. None of those things were part of the Jewish traditions at that time. So all examples, I would consider all of those examples of reading your own agenda into a passage. So then who was God talking to when he proclaimed, "Let us make man in our image and our likeness"? Most biblical scholars agree that it was just proper grammar for royalty. In this culture, when a king or high-ranking official spoke, they were speaking for all the people they ruled over and were expected to speak in plural pronouns. And even God, being the highest-ranking official ever, was not exempt from that rule. It's called the plural of respect. But I'm spending too much time on that. What's really important about the statement is that the part about God's image and likeness. So what did God mean by that? Well, it was a reference to the customs of the many organized religions of that time, which involved making statues, usually giant ones, of their god or gods, and worshiping them by bowing down to the created images. And what the author of this story is telling the reader is that none of that is necessary because we are already that image. So to worship this God, what we need to do is to be kind to our fellow human beings, be respectful to each other. When Moses came along and wrote the commandments, he emphasized that no one is to create a graven image of God. But the author here explains why. Because we already are that image. Not in the sense that God is a person with eyes and ears and hands, but that all of the qualities of God are ours. Intelligence, intuition, infinite potential, and so forth. So little bit like the analogy of the drop in the ocean. If you were to go to the ocean with an eyedropper, pick up a small drop, now what you have in your eyedropper is not the ocean, but everything about that drop is ocean. When you let it back out into the ocean, there's no disconnect. It flows back in. And then God takes his project in and says something to the effect of, yeah, looking good. Just like an artist would. And then on the seventh day, God rested. Now that's another clue that this is meant to be an allegory. God does not take days off. The reason that's put in there is to make the project an even 7 days, because the number 7 is a symbol of completeness. So that was a way of saying that the job was complete and the story was complete, and also a way of advising the reader to take the time to rest and meditate and get recentered when you've made a great accomplishment, and be ready to move on to the next great quest. Now, from there, the book moves into a series of allegories that go through the next 10 chapters of Genesis, starting with a very different creation story that was written by a different author several centuries earlier. And it tells of the first 2 people ever created by God, named Adam and Eve. Then it goes on to tell the tragic story about their children and other events that happen over the centuries as the earth gets populated. And of course, the story of Noah and the flood, after which the earth needs to be repopulated. And I wish I had time to go into those chapters, but I really want to have you look at the stories that start in chapter 12. This is where the writing starts to focus specifically on the origins of the Hebrew faith. And we're introduced to a character by the name of Abraham, or at first he's called Abram. And besides Jesus, he's actually my favorite character in the whole Bible. There's a never-ending debate about whether or not he was a real person, and no one really knows, but that's completely irrelevant. In the Jewish religion, he's regarded as the original Jew, father of the Jewish faith, and in Islam, he's also considered the father of their religion. But real or not, he did represent a real culture of Bedouin tribes who roamed the Arabian deserts and raised goats and sheep as their trade. And this tradition still lives on today, except now they have cell phones and portable TV sets for their tents. But back in the time that Abraham was supposed to have lived, which would have been about 16 to 1800 years BC, they had no formal religion. And they never stayed in one place long enough to become part of one. They had no central figure, no Jesus or Buddha, no Bible or Quran or Bhagavad Gita. And even if they'd had anything like that, very few of them ever learned how to read. They also had no temple or church or mosque to attend, no Dottie Boone, no Ernest Holmes or Edgar Casey or whoever your person is. So what did they have? It was a presence that they sensed intuitively, and they called it El. In our alphabet, it's spelled E-L. And that's the root word for all the Middle Eastern words they use for God. In Hebrew, Aleha, in Aramaic, Elohim, in Arabic, Allah. And that word loosely translates to the provider or the sustainer. It sounds like something from Star Trek, doesn't it? And so their religious traditions were based on 3 main things: storytelling, mysticism, and a very simple ceremony of the burnt offering. Now, the formalized burnt offering in the temple that we read about in later books in the Bible, in which the animal had to be slaughtered in a certain way on certain days by the temple priest, that came much later, when Moses came along and made this a formal legalistic religion. But in the time of Abraham, and for generations after him, the altar in which the animal was sacrificed to God, El, as a burnt offering, was simply a barbecue pit. They were having a barbecue. So more Americans have burnt offerings on the 4th of July in their backyards than there ever were in the Middle East. So whenever the tribes would have a prosperous breeding season of their livestock, or a male child was born, or there was any reason at all to celebrate, they would slaughter their best animal and have a barbecue, give thanks for the wonderful occasion. But how was it that they were offering it to God? Well, the idea of the smoke going up into heaven to God, is God's way of getting it to his dining room table. That was a concept that also came later. These people realized that this being was everywhere present, not watching them from way up high. They realized that by sharing their abundant blessings, they were giving back to God. So they invited anyone who was around to join the party and have some food. So if excuse me, if a group of people were traveling through the desert and smelled the meat cooking, they would say, yeah, the tribe is having a burnt offering. Let's go join them. And they would be welcome to the party, and the women would wash their feet and feed them. Now, the other important aspect of this life was mysticism. As I mentioned earlier, in the time they took to go within and listen to that still small voice, whenever they needed to find water, which often ran scarce in those areas, or when there was a dispute within the family to settle, or whatever problems happened upon them. Realizing that this divine presence always leads us only to our highest and greatest good, and then letting the dreams and visions be guideposts to that blessing or healing, and then going into a meditation or simply taking a nap and knowing that the answer would be given to them. Second, and of course, storytelling, in which the patriarch of the tribe would gather all the younger members together and tell them stories of this God, El, or how he first created the world, like the story we were just looking at, or the time God called upon a guy named Noah to build an ark. And then eventually some of these stories got written down by scribes and in time redacted and made part of that famous book. And those were the main components. It was a very simple religion, but not always easy to practice. It wasn't for these people, and certainly isn't for us in this society in which we have so much more noise and so many more distractions. It was the religion that the prophets of the Old Testament practiced, Isaiah and Jeremiah, and was the other major one, Ezekiel. That's a whole other talk. It was also the religion that Jesus of Nazareth followed and practiced many centuries later. So when we're introduced to this tribe leader named Abraham, or Abram, as he's already 75 years old, and he has this mystical experience, a conversation with God, and is told that he would be the father of a great nation. Now, this is an Eastern way of saying that he had a great idea and realized it was good enough to be true. Not unlike when Dr. Martin Luther King proclaimed, "I have a dream." If you've ever listened to that speech, you can tell he certainly knew it was good enough to be true. And so in the Middle East, he would say that God made a covenant with Martin Luther King. But getting back to Abraham, in his time, this tradition, this spiritual practice I was just talking about, was dying out. More and more members of these tribes were leaving and marrying into other cultures, taking up the sedentary lifestyle and polytheistic religions. So his mission in life was to keep that tradition of monotheism alive. The problem was he had no children to pass this lifestyle on to, and he was already 75 years old, and his wife, Sarai, was 65. So he has many adventures, many mystical experiences, sometimes in the form of a conversation with God, other times in the form of God sending angels to visit his camp. And these were all understood as dreams and visions and opportunities to raise his consciousness. Most of the time, he followed that divine guidance. Sometimes he gets caught up in limited thinking, what we would call world mind consciousness. But overall, he keeps moving forward, like all of us. He would take a step back, then 2 steps forward, then another step back, and 3 or 4 steps forward. And in time, he evolves from having faith in God to having the faith of God. And that's when his name is changed to Abraham. Whenever you read about a name change in the Bible, it means the character is undergoing a consciousness shift. And finally, at the age of 100, and his wife, now called Sarah, at the age of 90, their first child is born. Really? He had already had 1 child with Sarah's handmaiden, an Egyptian woman, but this was to be the child to carry on the tradition and the next step in that evolution of this great nation he's to be the father of. But then comes the episode in this saga that really bothers a lot of people. God tells Abraham that he's to go into the mountains and sacrifice his son, roast him on the altar, supposedly giving Abraham the ultimate test of faith. And Abraham was about to do as he was told and kill his only son and sacrifice him on the burning altar. Then at that last minute, God told him, stop. You proved your devotion. You don't need to murder your son for me. There's a wild ram caught in the thickets over there. You can make that your sacrifice. And this is another passage that the atheists have a field day with. How could you worship a God that would do a thing like that to a man just to test his faith? And this is also a valid question. But what most of us don't understand was this was a dream Abraham was having. We can tell because he was in constant conversation with God the whole time. He had seen how this horrendous act of sacrificing your firstborn child was being practiced by other religions at that time. They would proclaim that no one is more devoted to their God or gods than we are. And here's the proof. And through this simple dream, Abraham realized that God does not require any kind of cruel ceremonial practices like that. It wasn't God testing Abraham, it was Abraham waking up to a higher understanding of God, achieving a higher consciousness through this simple dream. So he became the advancing front edge of that great nation that would unfold several generations later. And it didn't include any kind of nonsensical sacrificing of firstborn children. See? Now, how does that apply to us? Why would I even go through any of this? How many of you have a great idea that you're ready for it to be a great reality? And you know that it's good enough to be true? No one? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Lynn.
Yes. I'm thinking that the quality of love, that is something that I hold in my truest self, the power of love.
Thank you, Janet. So Are you willing to take the time each day to quiet yourself and quiet the chatter up here and listen to that still small voice? Whether you call it God or something else, doesn't matter, but simply know that it's ready to unfold as a great new experience by means of you. Not unlike the Zen teaching, in which we're given the image of sitting in a boat on a lake in the middle of a raging storm, and trying to keep the boat from capsizing. In a situation like that, even if a giant catfish were to jump up out of the water, we would likely not notice it in the midst of all that hassle of the raging storm. But when the weather calms down and the water is still and we're enjoying the serenity, even if a small minnow were to jump up, then we would notice it. And so it is with our thinking. When we let our minds be still, the answer is always there regardless, but that's when we let it unfold for us. Doesn't necessarily need to be as dramatic as Abraham's dream or that mystical experience Moses had later, in which God appears to him as a burning bush. Your own mystical experience is just as valid, and whatever symbols speak to you, simply know that this universal mind is expressing itself as your mind. Hence, the answers you seek are ready to express themselves to you and through you. And then pay close attention to your dreams and visions. And I hope that you found that chunk of input to your benefit in some way. So let's take a quick 5-minute break and then come back and we'll see what kind of input you have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. This was so rich and so powerful.
Thank you.
What a wonderful perspective.
And so I'll say to all of you what Jesus said to Judas: what you must do, do quickly, because we'll be back in 5.
Wonderful.
Is everyone back?
Yes.
That is, everyone who hasn't had enough for one evening?
I think everyone is back.
Okay, so real quick, I got a text earlier today by someone who wanted to be here, but can't and would like to watch this presentation on YouTube at a later date. She had a question, so I'll get to it real quick. She was asking about the outrageously long ancient ages that these biblical characters live to. Like, as you recall, the character of Abraham was 100 years old, and his wife Sarah was 90 when their first child was born, and he ultimately lived to be 175. And Noah before him lived to be 950, and Moses lived to be 120. And the answer is twofold. In this culture, especially in biblical times, but even some parts of the Middle East today, years are measured by lunar cycles or seasons. So that would make me 200 and never mind. But also, don't take the numbers literally. Numbers are often used to amplify the point that the writer's making in this culture. You can imagine if an author today were to write a book and a character said, I got to the parking lot and there were 1 million cars there. Now we know that no parking lot can fit 1 million cars. So we understand that comment to be an exaggeration to show how frustrated the character is that the parking lot was full. But just imagine if that book were read by someone 2,000 years from now. By that time, we won't be using cars or our current idiomatic expressions, so they would find that statement very confusing, right? So that's another point. But also, numbers are used a lot as symbols in this culture. Like in the creation story where we were exploring earlier, the number 7 is used very frequently as a symbol of completeness. Like in the Gospel of Matthew, when Simon Peter asked Jesus, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive someone when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" And Jesus answers, "Not 7 times, but 70 times 7. So this is a Middle Eastern way for Peter to ask, do I really have to completely forgive a person when he's not being nice to me? Completely let it go? And Jesus answers with, don't just forgive that person completely, also make forgiveness a way of life. See? So another important number is 40. And 40 is a symbol of the amount of time it takes to move to a higher consciousness. And a prime example of that is the story of Moses. He lived to be 120 years old. And the narration of his life is divided into 3 40-year periods. First 40 years, he lives in Egypt, being raised by the daughter of Pharaoh, getting the best education available at the time, and enjoying the upper class life, even though he was Hebrew by birth. Then the second 40 years, he's living out in the desert in the country of Midian. And then he's called by God to spend the final 40 years of his life leading the Hebrew tribes out of slavery in Egypt into the promised land and bring them together as a nation. So we look at these 3 periods symbolically. The first part of his life represents the intellectual preparation, just as we would do with our formal education or any extracurricular studying we do. The second set of 40 years represents his spiritual preparation, and it's at the end of that set of 40 years that he has that spiritual experience of God appearing as a burning bush, but unconsumed. Another example of this mysticism that I've been talking about. It was to be understood as a dream or vision, and thus began the final 40-year period of his life, in which he begins the task of freeing the Hebrew slaves and bringing them together to evolve from an extended family to a nation. And this represents doing it, moving into the experience. So none of those 3 periods in his life were meant to be thought of as literally 40 years. Each was a symbol of the time needed to evolve and build the consciousness. He might have been only 20 or 25 when he had to hightail it out of Egypt. He may have lived in the wilderness of Midian only 5 or 10 or 20 years. That's why a lot of this material is so frustrating for the Western reader. Numerical accuracy is just not a thing with Eastern writing. That's why, the doomsday prophets that are using the numbers in the Bible to predict that day when the rapture happens or whatever. The most recent one was Harold Camping, who predicted that rapture 5/21/2011. Total bust. But the reason for that is you just can't use numbers in the Bible like that way. That's not how the Eastern mind thinks of numbers. It's like I could say, I spent the last 3 days at Janet and Corey's place. What it would mean was, I went to Janet and Corey's place and I had a wonderful time. It may have just been for dinner and had nothing to do with 3 days. So that's the long answer to that question. So let's see what you all would like to discuss. I guess we should open the chat. Well, go ahead, Lynn.
Okay, I enjoyed this because it's really putting a lot of the story of Abraham and Sarai into real context of what life was like then. But interestingly, when you talk about age, um, I'm a teacher and I teach partly active older adults. And I went to an in service in 2015, and they said children being born now will probably live 100 to 100 and 120, that we're in an arithmetic expansion of the human life cycle. So whether we'll get so that I thought that when you mentioned the very Middle Eastern context of the Bible. I also thought, though, of the translation at the court of King James. And King James, in his own lifestyle, was very forgiving, wild living. He had what you'd almost a very debauched court in a way, but he ordered translations by poetic monks. So we do have the overlay of English language in the Bible that we read that reflects not our time, but a time around 1600 in England. So we have that influence. The other way that I'm looking at the whole story, this which was very well put together and helped me see lots of things, is in the context of the 50,000 year period where Creator was seen by gatherer people as matrifocal, or as the mother, the sustainer, and the provider. The when Abraham has the dream or whatever about not killing his son, but taking the ram that's caught in the thicket to the Native American or to the goddess practitioner, that ram caught in the thicket is also a child of the Creator and has a mother. So and the divine feminine teachings bring us to that. So looking at these contexts, piece within piece, that archaeology suggests for about 50,000 years almost that we did have most of the archaeology that relates in any way to the divine often uses feminine forms because the concept of birther was better known at that time. So there are worlds within worlds. One thing you said that you didn't
And a common thread among these worlds.
True. One thing that you mentioned in your own background, that you didn't have a religious background, but I had learned recently that you have from the Family of Man group, that you did have some youthful experiences in that time. And that I wondered, Family of Man was a group led by a woman named Marcia Hunter, later changing her name, like Abraham. But I wondered if you had anything to say about how that affected you in your spiritual progression, yay or nay.
I don't want to disappoint you, but nay. I mean, my association with the Family of Man was through my mother, and she was very much into it. I would go along with her to, on Sunday mornings because I thought the people were very nice, um, and there were people my age who were a lot nicer than the people at school. I just didn't really understand what was being taught at the time, but it was an outlet for me to be open to teachings like that.
Thanks.
So when I got to be older, and that is what led me to New Thought teachings. So in a way, it was a catalyst, but
I see. Thank you.
That's beautiful. And I just want Mary, will you unmute?
I unmuted, yes. First of all, I want to say to you that you're banging. What's that sound? Nobody else hears it? Oh, I'm doing it.
Okay.
The concept of Abraham responding to a dream versus the act of God was very powerful to me. And it seems to me, I don't quite understand why teachers of the Bible don't put an introductory prologue that says something as simple as, because I've had very unpleasant discussions with other teachers who says, no, it says in the Bible, it's a day, it's a 24-hour day. And, it's so illogical that it precludes people who have more logical thinking mind from gaining an experience with the mystical. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I wonder if we have some thoughts about how we might be able to improve that so that people could retain their scientific thinking, but yet understand that doesn't preclude connecting with a higher spiritual power.
Well, that's something we've been asking for centuries now. In the Western world, we have a habit of saying, prove me, and not bothering to look not just at the story, but where it's pointing. And again, like I was saying, try to read out from it. Try to walk a mile in the shoes of the people it was being written for. So yeah, what we need to do is get more people like Dr. Rocco Errico out there to help us have a better understanding of ancient writings and the minds of these ancient people. The problem is we're too wrapped up in being right about each of us about our religion. So that's something that we'll understand better with time. I hope that.
Thank you. It does help me, and thank you for your teaching tonight. They were very helpful.
Thank you, Mary.
Wonderful. And I know that Donna, you have your hand raised.
Thank you. And thank you, Tim. That was a very interesting presentation. That is the first that I've heard that Abraham taking his son out to be killed at God's request was a dream. And I'm very bothered by that. I'm going to go back and read the passages because, I mean, who is saying that was a dream? I mean, is it listed in the Bible that it was a dream, or is that conjecture?
Mm-mm. So the people that these writings were intended for would understand this right off when you hear a conversation with God from a character like Abraham or Moses, or when the prophets say, "Thus saith the Lord," meaning they had a dream and God spoke to them in that dream. But that would be understood by the people that was intended for. So it doesn't say specifically, and that's why we don't generally.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
What?
How do you know that?
This is one of the many things I learned from reading the books by Dr. Rocco Errico and several lessons I've attended of his, also from Dr. George Lamza, who was the interpreter of the Aramaic version of the Bible, which I recommend everyone adopt as their version. And Dr. Lamza was a Middle Eastern mystic from a society that, people like Abraham or Moses would feel very at home in. And he studied the Bible in the Aramaic language. And so that's where I get this information from.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I don't mean to put you on the spot. It just threw me, and I just wonder where these people, got this idea that it was a dream, just because I never heard that before in growing up in the Lutheran Church.
Yeah, because, well, Rocco Errico was a longtime student of Dr. George Lamza, but George Lamza came from that culture in which that, even in his day, in the middle of the 20th century, it was a common practice. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
it is so wonderful to have these cultural backdrops as an understanding, and like going
Agreed.
back to the original Aramaic, which is the original translation, and it's been translated, of course, many times in many different languages, but having that cultural base along with what terminology means is powerful, and I really thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, Lynn. Or no,
Oh,
I'm sorry,
Joan.
you're next, Lynn.
Joan. Yeah, Joan has not had a chance yet, so then we'll come back to Lynn.
Of course.
So, Tim, what I hear you saying is that when they write something down, they're not referring to an event. They're talking about an idea or a dream that they had. And that this is what they dreamed. Or this was their idea. It's not a recitation of facts.
Well, yes and no. Not everything, like in the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and later, Moses in the Exodus, those were intended to be historical accounts, so-called. It's when you hear the person having that conversation with God directly, like in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham is having this bargaining conversation with God as if he's a person who's deciding whether or not to destroy the city. That's mysticism. That's a dream or a vision. When you see the city actually get destroyed due to bad weather, due to volcanic activity, that's supposed to be what actually happens when he wakes up. And when Lot, his nephew and his family are exiting the city because they had been informed by God through a dream that, or actually God sent, in Lot's case, God sent angels to him. That's a whole other story, to tell him, get out of that city. It's a nasty place and God's going to destroy it. In that case, during that episode where he's talking to these angels, these messengers, symbolic of God sending a message, or sending messengers as angels, just as a king would send messengers. That's a dream, that's a vision. But when they're actually leaving the city, and you get this part of the story where his wife turns back and looks at what's going on, the nasty destruction. It says she turned into a pillar of salt. That's supposed to be an account of what happened when they use the term turning into a pillar of salt. You know what that means? She had a stroke. So it's a mixture of dreams and then how they went about their lives.
Well, sometimes my kids and I get together and talk about our camping trips, and they become dreams.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of, because it all floats around in each of our memories in different ways. So I wonder if that's also what happened. It floats around as time passes, and then finally they agree on this one version.
Yeah, and all of these stories, you might notice, are woven together, redacted from different storytellers telling the same stories. That's especially true in the book of Genesis. So, and
anyway,
does that answer your question, though, Joan?
Thank you very much for the dissertation. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I know, Lynn, you had something.
Well, it was a couple more comments. That one of the things you asked us is how was the Bible used like in our childhood? And I was thinking to later when I joined that group later called the Family of Man, and I saw these people a bit older than myself. It was a youngish group. they were trying to decide whether they were being led to go to Montana because there were earthquakes or something about a child coming into the group, and they would open the Bible on the table and they would go into an interstate and they would place their hand on a passage, and it became almost a tool for an intuitive tool of divination. So that was my experience. That's how it was used in that group. But also
And
going
it's
back,
great, but you don't have to have your Bible for that. You can use Emerson's essays or
you
the
could, but
Tao
I
Te.
think there was the idea that the Bible still it contained an essential spirit of divine guidance. And I later studied it at West Valley College as a work of literature. And then in graduate school, I had a friend who wrote the Bible and Reincarnation. So I started looking at the translations and everything, but feel that there's still an essential living spirit in it, just through the cultural layers. That so that yes, and it's a reminder that we can connect. And so that was a more simplistic use of it. I was thinking about some of the things about Genesis that you mentioned. I think I mentioned in my book Edgar Casey and the Eternal Feminine, which looked at the reemerging goddess tradition and how it links with our metaphysical traditions, which often had a Judeo-Christian base. And there were passages that still survive, like male and female created they them in their own image, which suggested to me the androgyny that is present in so many creation myths around the world, including, I think,
Yeah.
with the Canaanites way back. So for me, it was looking at and seeing elements of it in the surviving Bible. In Jeremiah 44, the women are lamenting to Jehovah and talking about how things aren't going very well for them, and saying that it says actually in verse 16, when we worshiped the Queen of Heaven, we had bread, we had cakes, we were well fed. We had plenty of victuals, using the 15th century word of the translation. And did you think we worship by ourselves? No, our husbands also. So in that, it was like one patrifocal time referring back to a matrifocal time. So the Bible has some rich nuggets in it that I think can reflect that.
Yeah.
And finally, I just wanted to share one apocryphal book. Oh, sorry, one apocryphal story, and then I will stop. It was about that wasn't concluded in the later Council of Nicaea current Bible, but it's an earlier creation myth, and it was one of the ones considered. And in it, God is both Sabaoth, the masculine protection and strength, and Sophia, the feminine wisdom. And the world is created in this myth when Sophia casts droplets out on the ethers. One becomes Adam, one becomes Zoe. But Adam at that point lacks a soul. So Zoe, his companion, breathes life into him, and he says, "Forever after, I will call you Eve, for you are the mother of the living." That was another draft considered. The Bible has a rich history.
Yeah, and that story is a large part of the Gnostic tradition.
Yes.
Gnostic Christian tradition.
Thank you so much. And Donna, you have your hand up? Okay, I wanted to make sure.
I forgot to put it down. I'm sorry.
No worries. This is such a rich discussion. This is amazing. Does anyone else have any comments or questions or thoughts? We would love to hear it.
Tim, I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you, Lacey.
And the depth and richness of it.
Thank you.
Yeah. I remember when you first started.
About 1 million years ago.
Yeah, I know. God.
And I gotta say, these two people here, you'll see Reverend Mary Jo Sperry somewhere in your grid,
Hi, JoJo.
and,
Lacey.
and Reverend Lacey. They were two of my best mentors.
Oh, my goodness.
To this day, I give thanks.
Very nice.
Well, we want to acknowledge both of you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much for being here.
Thank
Part
you.
of this.
Tim, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it was very well presented, that we could really understand your points. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mary Jo.
It was rich and scholarly.
And
Arlene, you had your hand open?
Yes.
Yes.
I enjoyed this so immensely. I could take 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more sessions with it, going through the Bible in that interpretations. And so I want to thank you for this. I also want to apologize because when I was writing this chat, I was writing it. I didn't realize when I did a return that it would post it. But I got right on the beginning of your talk when you were talking about God and they said, or using God as a plural, but your explanation of that takes it kind of away from the plural, which I rather have had an idea that that plural is what was really meant. So I would like to maybe investigate what that original was saying. But my idea is more mystical, and it goes into the teaching of UCM of being, we are one with God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got this vision that, you know, when we're in spirit, we were looking at planet Earth and what we would be doing there as individuations, you know, different people.
Yeah.
But so we would be looking at creating it together. So let's just look at even our own group here. Say we were the ones in spirit and we were grouped together in spirit as we were talking, just like we're talking here, and say, okay, so what will we do? The first day we'll do this, the second day we'll do that. Because it comes back to our teaching in UCM that we are one and we are one spirit, and yet individually we have voices. Does that make any kind of sense?
Yeah. Well, to me it does.
I was brought into
It's-
UCM through Reverend Tom Gary and his poem, The Church of One. Still
Exactly.
speaks to me. Still speaks to me.
I have actually made a song out of it, and I was singing it to a group of people that had not had the opportunity to hear it. And it is relevant today as it was when our wonderful Reverend Tom just wrote it.
Yes.
It's that invitation to be a part of that Church of One. Yes, so beautiful, Tim. It's exactly.
Was that a regular part of your services?
We have sung it. We have shared it,
Okay.
you know, on and off many times in many different ways. I think it's time for it to be perhaps resurrected again to be shared.
you know, I like the Zoom in really expressing the oneness of who we are. That we are a unique expression, but we are all one. And you see all the beautiful faces, all expressing, but we're all on this one.
That's true.
You know, we're all on this one screen. You know, we are unique expressions of that oneness, but we are all one. And
Yes.
I always feel that this is just a wonderful example of wonderful. It's a wonderful example an explanation of oneness, or the divine expressing in its beautiful diversity.
Yeah.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. The divine expressing in its beautiful diversity.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Well said, as always, Lacey. And it's important to remember that we don't want to think of ourselves as part of God. We want to think of ourselves as God expressing in a unique way. Just like
co-creators with the Father, Mother, Source.
Yeah. Like I have a finger here that is not part of me, because if I were to lose it, I can't just go to an auto shop and buy a new finger. It's me expressing myself as this finger in a unique way. Of course, you probably noticed when I speak, it expresses itself in a unique way. But that's how we want to think of ourselves, God expressing itself in a unique way.
I would hope that we would consider another class on this kind of material that you might be available in the future. Personally, it opened a lot of doors for me, and I'm old. I'm in my 80s, and I've been studying for a long time, and it's still opened new doors for me, and that's very exciting. And so I would hope we would consider going forward another opportunity to look at it.
Okay. Talk to the boss here. I'm pointing.
Oh, I will. Oh.
Is it a pal of the boss?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is such a deep, multi-layered conversation that we can have. That is at kind of the source, the essence of our spiritual, strength and belief. And, taking all of this into consideration and all of the different manifestations of that expression.
Most of us were raised in a Judeo-Christian tradition and culture, and to get a broader understanding of how those teachings, as he's pointing out tonight, were meant for the people of a particular place in the world, a particular culture, can help us see the confusion with fundamentalists taking things literally and metaphysicians interpreting, and we're getting a broader picture historically of where we come from and trying to come back to that essence of truth. Can I share one more Gnostic story?
Beautiful.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay. Well, it's of course fits my interest in the divine feminine. And the Gnostics really were the early Christians, but in the Council of Nicaea, the Empress Timothea, they were, books were taken out and certain things were decided to be held, and the others became the mystical fringe. But anyway, there's another one in which Yahweh is stating, I am God, I am all that is, I am the one, and it goes on, and eventually there's a soft voice from the uppermost chamber in heaven, and Sophia's mother, and she says, "Be quiet, foolish one." So he'd forgotten the mother and the feminine made the whole. He had to come back in balance with the mother.
I love that.
And that's what I really enjoy about the Gnostic teaching. Also, those books that were chucked and left on the cutting room floor and have been considered the mystical fringe. I want to recommend to everyone the Gospel of Thomas. And
there was a Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and there's a church in Palo Alto in an upstairs building, and it has met some form of it since after Jesus's death, when there were prophecies that who would help to carry on, and Mary Magdalene had some dreams and visions that fit that, but she was a woman, and so there was another splitting off, and that church still operates today in an upstairs room in Palo Alto. So there are many ways in which the Bible itself, which part of the Bible are we talking about too? Thought-provoking.
She's considered as one of the disciples of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Magdalene. Yeah.
Yes, but there's a
Yeah,
separate gospel of Mary Magdalene as well.
Yes, that's
yeah.
Thomas.
This is what scholars are finally getting across to people. We have all these. We painted a picture of her, like in the Hollywood movies, that she was a harlot who was in love with Jesus and so forth. But there's nothing in the scriptures to really say that directly, and more and more they're teaching that she was a disciple of Jesus, like the others mentioned, but she was a woman, so marginalized disciple, but one of his best, nevertheless. So,
In some of the sacred texts that survive, like Sumerian texts that had to do with the matrifocal period, or knowledge of through archaeology of some of the rituals, sometimes in that culture, just the counterpart to what you talked about tonight, the birth of a daughter could be a special blessing and a special feast. So it depended on the perspective, of the culture as to which
Absolutely.
aspect of the creator was really celebrated.
Absolutely. It's all culturally based, what is going to be highlighted. And that's the power, I believe, Tim, of what you are bringing open to us today to discuss. It has all to do with the kind of cultural paradigm that we are in. And I'm just reminded of Arlene, who is a Huna healer and Lomi Lomi, and has taken on the native Hawaiian traditions and spiritual practice and turned that into and synthesized that into some amazing things. So as you were saying, Mary, I think this is so important for us to go more into depth about this, because as we consider these different, I call them well springs, these different well springs of knowledge and mysticism and experience and healing traditions, what a rich foundation that will make.
I think she's right. Coming back to the problems in the Middle East today, I read in the writings of my teacher, the late Jessica Madigan, her work on the past lives of Jesus and Mary, drawn both from Casey's work and insight into the Bible. And she explored for a long time the story of Abraham and Sarai, even from the standpoint of their hopes and their human frailties, which pertains to the Middle East today, the dividing of the Semitic people. And in it, Sarah, loved her husband, but it was such a long time she waited to have this child that she then wrongly was part of the exile of the child of the concubine and Hagar into the desert, so that the human weaknesses that we're struggling with, our self focus versus our focus on the greater good, existed in Bible times and have their ramifications as that myth plays out in the world today.
anyone else?
Yeah, Tim, I think you could give another lecture. The one, the one on the second writing of Genesis, chapter 2.
Talk to the boss.
That would be interesting. You alluded to it,
Okay.
but
I'll just say one thing here real quick. God did not create two trees and tell the first two people he created, you can eat from that one, but leave that one alone. Because God knows us. I mean, how many of you have ever seen a sign that says wet paint? I mean, you just can't resist.
well, I'm going to be leaving. It's been a beautiful experience with all of you. And who's that, Mary? Mary, I tell you what, you said you were 80 years old. You look like you were 50. And what a joy. So have a good night. And I really enjoyed all of you.
Thank you so much, Lacey.
Nice
Okay.
to connect with
Thank you
you.
for your contributions to this.
Absolutely. It was a joy to have you here.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Mary Jo.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, honey.
Okay, before anyone else leaves, let me do a closing prayer real quick. This will be the Lord's Prayer as it fell from Jesus' mouth over 2,000 years ago in the language that he spoke, that is ancient Aramaic. Okay, so, Awun deshmea netketeshmak tate malakuta newe siwe yanaka akana shwak mea aparak haulan lakma sun kanan yamana washwak lan haubin akana kapnan shwaknin laha yawain la ta'alan Nishiona ella pasan min bisha mitol dulaki maltuta hela tishpota alam almin. And together, Amen.
Can you translate it to us?
Amen.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, etc.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was beautiful. And typically we go till 8 o'clock, from 6 to 8 o'clock, but whatever, time you wish to leave, you can always leave, whenever, but we have this space allotted. And so we do have a few more minutes if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
What's interesting in the Aramaic prayer, Donna Zahner sent it to me again recently, and I remember studying to be a minister at Tom and Mary Gary's house long ago, and somebody brought the Aramaic prayer that Tim just kindly read to us in the original language, and it was nice for me. It was just starting my where's the feminine in all this, to realize when God was also called the birther, and they were joint images in the translation of that prayer that had both the feminine and masculine aspects. So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Now the Arun, which sort of translates to our Father, in the last shutting down. In the last seminar I attended, Dr. Rocco Errico, he pointed out that the name Abba does not mean daddy, which he would say, which would be translated to the Father within. It simply means my beloved, and the same with the term Arun, our Father. It's our beloved.
Nice.
So,
that's beautiful. Our beloved.
The oneness.
I love that term. It's wonderfly inclusive.
A radical thing to say when normally the perception of God would be our overlord. So
this is amazing.
Next time when John Simmons and I come, if people have stories of encountering an angel, if in real life, in dreams, strong feelings of angelic intervention, please come along to share those.
And that will be on the 14th of November. So please join us via Zoom from 6 to 8 p.m. John and Lynn will be speaking about those angelic connections. Absolutely. Yes, Arlene.
Tim, would you give us the names of the books that you were referring to? So if you have future programs, it might be good for me to be able to get that book, because the thinking that of the Eastern or Middle Eastern is so different, and
Right.
it kind of acclimates your mind to accept looking at them differently. So the names of the books.
The first book I would recommend on that subject is the one I mentioned earlier, Let There Be Light,
Okay.
by Dr. Rocco Errico, Roccoerrico. Make that your first one by him, and then he has a lot of material out there.
Okay.
Specific books, including each of the commentary on each of the four Gospels in the light, in Aramaic light. And another one that I was exploring this week as I was preparing for this talk is it's called The Syrian Christ by Abraham Rahani or Rabbani. It's came out in 1916, and he was another immigrant who was immersed in the biblical culture that hadn't really developed in a country that was still underdeveloped. And he explains the culture and where these idioms come from also really well. And I don't know if the book is in print, but you can find it free online as a PDF. So.
And the name again?
Abraham Rahani, Rahany, I believe. But the book is called The Syrian Christ.
The way that you painted that image of being in the desert, I mean, the sensory picture that you drew, that stays with me. You know, just being and the quietude and the non-connection to organized structure and being out in the desert and the listening within, that really stays. It felt like I had a glimpse different than the stereotype you were taking us away from, you know, with the punitive God and the rigid rules, but to picture ourselves in that desert of old and only listening within. And that really, I thought, was very valuable.
Yeah, and you'll notice in the story of Moses, like I was saying, that second 40 years of his life, supposedly, however long it actually was, he spent in the desert, Midian, away from the noise of society, and growing spiritually simply by keeping the mind quiet. And when we get to the Gospel of Matthew, in which they're trying to tell the reader, because this was written for a Jewish audience, we have here another Moses, and he's going to do us one better. And so what do we first read about him doing? Spending 40 days in the desert.
That was another good point. I mean, you showed the scope of time of the Old Testament and the much shorter scope of the New. 1,000 years to write something. Wow, that's playing a huge game of telephone where the story can change and evolve and evolve.
Yeah.
And then only 50 years to write something. And if we think back now, 50 years back from now, we'll know what we were doing 50 years ago. Some of us knew each other 50 years ago. It's not that far back. And that you presented Jesus as as the outgrowth, of consistent with this tradition. So I think he brought a lot of perspective we don't usually think about.
That's another thing, critics of the Bible will have a field day with. This gospel, the story of Jesus wasn't written until 50 years after his death. But remember, in this society, they didn't have all these distractions all these things to clog up your head like we do. And so if they heard Jesus speak, give an outdoor sermon 50 years or however many years later, they could recite it as if they'd heard it a few minutes ago.
Isn't that true of anything that happened to us 50 years ago with great impact? You know, some of us met each other then, or, you know, and those, and as stories are told and kept alive, as people talk about it to each other, it's strengthened in ways too over the 50 years.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And also the acknowledgement, and every spiritual tradition that I have studied talks about going to that still, quiet place,
right,
where we can meditate and receive. I mean, every tradition that I've studied has a way for us to do that, a mechanism by which we can do that. And in our busy, hectic lives, you know, holding all that we hold for the world, it can be sometimes difficult to find those still, quiet moments. And so it's that invitation. It's that invitation.
Theologian Matthew Fox talked about the exoteric religions. We think they're all different, and people are fighting to this moment based on the perceived differences. But in the esoteric heart, or the still small voice, it's so one person can recognize another in a different faith and know their heart, because we're listening to that. We're listening from within.
We're listening to that underground river, that thing that unifies all of us.
The universe, the transpersonal, beyond the persona or the mask.
Right.
And like my teacher, Dr. J. Scott Neal, also used to say, when you look at the essence of all religions, they're all the same. Not the theology or the symbols or the figures or the story. That's when it gets very different, because they were created for different audiences. But when you get to the essence, which is what you two were just talking about.
The Church of One, the esoteric heart. In the beginning of the pandemic, when I was much alone, I would take walks at Los Gatos Cemetery, and it's an eclectic cemetery. It's an eclectic cemetery with a Buddhist section and a Jewish section and all these different sections. And I noticed on the graves, the main comment was, he or she loved others. And it crossed all of the traditions. That's what he or she was remembered for, the loving of others, or the good. And it didn't matter, you know, if it was written in characters, the translation was about love and those basic principles.
Absolutely.
So Lynn, you had mentioned the translation from Aramaic directly into English on the Lord's Prayer. So I went digging on Facebook to find where it was written. And may I read it?
Yes, please do. Please do.
O cosmic birther of all radiance and vibration, soften the ground of our being and carve out a space within us where your presence can abide. Fill us with your creativity so that we may be empowered to bear the fruit of your mission. Let each of our actions bear fruit in accordance with our desire. Endow us with the wisdom to produce and share that what each being needs to grow and flourish. Untie the tangled threads of destiny that bind us and release others from the entanglement of past mistakes. We do not let us be seduced by that which would divert us from our true purpose, but illuminate the opportunities of the present moment. For you are the ground and the fruitful vision, the birth, power, and fulfillment, as all is gathered and made whole once again. And so,
so it is. Beautiful, Anne. That's what I was just going to look up myself. So thank you for looking that up, because the language is powerful.
Very.
Yes.
And it encompasses, because I came from, although I have one part of my family that's very religious, and I have a cousin that is a rabbi, and my mother was in protest of that, so I was separated from that a lot. And I, at a very early age, just channeled that God was in everybody and everything. And the Bible is very new in my life. It's only really since I found, UCM, and so it's been interesting to me. And so it's prayers like this, that pure Aramaic, without going through to the Greek, to the to English, and coming through, it has a much purer meaning to me and can touch much more deeply, and doesn't have what I would consider a more dogmatic viewpoint. So
Absolutely.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
My,
And
my,
Joan, you had something. Joan.
So my stepson and his wife are absolute atheists. And when I start talking about God and everything, they say, "Oh yeah, it's nice that you believe in that stuff," and blah blah blah. So he was very, very sick. And when you were talking about all religions and all languages come down to the same thing, he was very sick, and he was sick with colonoscopy and colon cancer and a lot of complications. And it wasn't like a week, it was like a couple of months. And when it was all over, he was talking and he said, and I said, "So what got you through this? How did you think? Or, what was your thinking?" He said, "I found a very small, quiet spot deep within me that was always there and I could count on it. And I remembered to get back there whenever things got too tough." And
Beautiful, beautiful.
I said, "Oh, some of us call that God."
Oh, what a beautiful bridge building that was.
Yeah, you don't have to be a Dottie Boone or Lynn Rogers to be a mystic.
That's right.
Or a Mary Gary or a Tim Mauro or a Janet Childs or an Arlene or everyone here.
Right.
You don't have to know the language. The language comes to you.
That's right. And on that level, on that message, I think we need to just thank Tim for opening up the gates to this amazing conversation.
Yes.
Amazing conversation.
Here.
Thank you so much.
The same with if any of you had missed it.
Yes. And if you, my friends, can do something special for yourself to connect yourself to that energy, we would offer that you do that in the next week. That you can fully take this in and perhaps even re-listen to it and just be in that spirit. And thank you again. And again, this is a UCM production. And if you would like to make a donation, we would love it. We offer that to you.
Thank you so much, Janet.
Thank you. Thank you,
Janet.
beautiful ones.
Bye-bye.
For doing all you do, Janet.
Oh, it's my honor.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you,
Grateful.
Janet.
Grateful. Look at the kitties. I'm loving the kitties. There were a lot of kitties. My kitty as well. We're on screen today. That was wonderful. Yeah. Thank you all.
Good night.
Good night. Sweet dreams.